The Ashkenazi enigma. Sensation. They are not what they seem. Ashkenazi Jews are one of the most well-known and discussed ethnic groups in the world. Their influence is disproportionate to their numbers, from Albert Einstein to Mark Zuckerberg, from Sigmund Freud to Steven Spielberg. Many great minds had Ashkenazi roots. But who are they really? Increasingly in scientific circles, unexpected theses are being voiced. The genetic profile of Ashkenazim is so complex and unusual that it literally does not fit into classic ethnic frameworks. Their DNA is a mosaic of the Middle East, Europe, and someone else. Why do they differ so sharply from other Jews? Why do they alone present unique genetic mutations? And most importantly, how did a small group of people become one of the most prominent intellectual forces of the 20th century? The answers are shocking. Who are the Ashkenazi Jews? It is not just an ethnonym. It is the key to a 1,000-year migration across Eurasia. The word Ashkenaz first appears in Jewish texts as early as the early Middle Ages and is associated with the mythical descendant of Japheth, the son of the biblical Noah. But in real history, this came to refer to Jews who moved to Central Europe, to the territory of Germany, and later Poland and Lithuania. Their language, Yiddish, inherited the structure of Germanic dialects but absorbed both Jewish and Slavic elements. This was not just a diaspora, but a unique subethnic group formed far from their homeland. By the 10th–14th centuries, Ashkenazim already made up the majority of Europe's Jewish population. Their lifestyle, traditions, and religious practices differed from those of the Sephardim, Jews of the Mediterranean. They adapted to new conditions but retained their distinctiveness. It was then that the very Ashkenazi code began to take shape. Cultural, social, and, as would later be revealed, genetic. The Bible mentions the name Ashkenaz. But who was he really? The name Ashkenaz appears in the book of Genesis. He is the grandson of Japheth, progenitor of the Indo-European peoples. In medieval Jewish texts, this name began to denote not a person, but a territory. The land of Ashkenaz. This came to refer to the lands of the Germanic area, where by the 8th–9th centuries Jewish communities from southern Europe had settled. But where did this association come from? Perhaps the Scythians are involved, ancient tribes of the northern Black Sea region, whom the Greeks called Scythians, and Jewish sources considered descendants of Ashkenaz. Thus, the term absorbed not only geography but fragments of ancient ethnology. This image, semi-legendary, hybrid, became the basis for a new Jewish ethnonym. The mingling of myths, history, and migrations gave rise to a concept that concealed a unique historical process, and within it, the unexpected role of the Khazar Khaganate. The Khazar Empire and the conversion of its elite. Was ethnogenesis involved here? In the 9th century, a powerful state stretched across the steppes of Eastern Europe. The Khazar Khaganate. Its ruling elite, according to Arab and Jewish chroniclers, adopted Judaism. This event was long considered semi-fantastic, but it is confirmed by a whole range of sources. Some historians suggest that the collapse of Khazaria and the westward migration of its population were among the key factors in the formation of the Ashkenazi ethnos. Particularly intriguing is the hypothesis that a significant part of Eastern European Jews are not descendants of the Jerusalem diaspora, but of Turkic Khazars who adopted Judaism and assimilated among Slavs. Genetics partially confirms this. Ashkenazi DNA contains markers characteristic of the peoples of the steppe belt. No wonder this theory was long hushed up. It disrupts the familiar narrative of a purely biblical origin. When large-scale genetic studies of Ashkenazi Jews began in the 21st century, scientists were confronted with a real sensation. It had been expected that most of their genome would be Middle Eastern, like that of modern inhabitants of the Levant. But it turned out that only a small portion of Y chromosomes actually point to Semitic origin. The main genetic background is a mix of Eastern European, Balkan, and even Turkic components. Particularly surprising was the presence of the R1a haplogroup, typical for Slavs and steppe peoples. Mitochondrial lines, maternal DNA, turned out to be almost entirely European. This indicates that local women of non-Semitic origin participated in the formation of the Ashkenazim. Thus, a unique population emerged, with Middle Eastern ideology but European biology. Scientists were shocked. The usual division into Semites and Europeans does not work here. Among the many Y-chromosomal haplogroups associated with the ancient Middle East, the J group holds a special place. It is considered a marker of primary Semites. But when scientists analyzed the DNA of tens of thousands of Ashkenazim, the results were staggering. Only about 10 to 15% of them actually carry this Middle Eastern haplogroup. Moreover, the overwhelming majority, on the paternal line, show genetic markers common among Slavs, Germans, Caucasians, and even Balkan peoples. The most frequent was the R1a haplogroup, typical, for example, of Poles and Russians. Also recorded are E1b, North Africa, G2, Caucasus, and even Q, Asian steppes. Thus, the ancient Hebrew male line has been preserved only in a narrow part of the Ashkenazim, a few among millions. The rest are the result of a complex ethnogenetic mosaic. One of the most striking discoveries in Ashkenazi genetics was the detection of the R1a Y haplogroup, the very one predominant among Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Poles. In certain clusters of Ashkenazi male populations, its frequency reaches 50%. But there is a nuance. Among Jews, it is represented by a specific sub-branch, R1a M582, almost never found among non-Jewish Slavs. This suggests that it is not a direct borrowing, but a unique line likely formed within the Jewish environment of Eastern Europe. Nevertheless, the fact remains. Genetically, Ashkenazim are much closer to local Slavs than, for example, to Sephardim or Mizrahim. This discovery shatters stereotypes. Foreign blood turned out to be quite kindred. And if the enemies of Jews in the past sought to portray them as entirely other, at the molecular level there may be more in common than different. If the male lines of Ashkenazim appear as a tangled knot of Middle Eastern, Slavic, and Turkic roots, the female lines are even more surprising. Mitochondrial DNA, passed strictly through the maternal line, showed that the overwhelming majority of Ashkenazi women did not originate in the Middle East at all. Geneticists identified only 4 mitochondrial lines from which almost all Ashkenazi Jews descend. And here's the key. All these lines are of European origin, mainly from areas of northern Italy and Central Europe. Dating, about 2,000 years ago. This means that Jewish men who arrived in Europe entered into unions with local women, non-Jews by origin. These marriages may have been voluntary or perhaps linked to the conversion of women to Judaism. In any case, the female genetics of Ashkenazim are purely European, and this is one of the main secrets of their ethnogenesis. The reconstruction of the early history of Ashkenazim reveals an interesting imbalance. Fathers, carriers of Middle Eastern and Eurasian Y chromosomes; mothers, almost entirely of European origin. Such a demographic model suggests a small group of male migrants who arrived in Europe with an already established religious identity. These men, perhaps merchants, missionaries, or exiles, founded communities and married local women, often converted to Judaism. Thus arose a unique symbiosis. Jewish religion and traditions were preserved, but passed to children through an entirely new European maternal line. This explains why Ashkenazi culture retains elements of ancient Hebrew religion, while bearing a strong imprint of the European environment. This process was not instantaneous, but extended over centuries. And it is precisely this that shaped the genetic face of the Ashkenazim as we know it today. At first glance, Yiddish sounds like German, and this is not surprising. Its foundation lies in Middle High German dialects spoken in the Rhine region in the 10th–12th centuries. But Yiddish is not just a dialect, it is a linguistic mirror of Ashkenazi history. It absorbed Hebrew terms, Slavic forms, even traces of Romance vocabulary. It is the language of the diaspora, created at the crossroads of civilizations. Unlike Hebrew, which for a long time remained sacred and non-conversational, Yiddish was the living, everyday language of millions of Eastern European Jews. It developed in conditions where Ashkenazim were a minority among Christian peoples, yet in constant cultural dialogue with them. The language became the cultural glue that preserved identity even in exile and isolation. Yiddish is the product of the very assimilation that genetics is silent about, but history shouts. Over the centuries, Ashkenazi Jews endured the harshest trials: expulsions, pogroms, epidemics, ghettos, and the Holocaust. But they not only survived, they managed to preserve their identity and even become one of the most prominent intellectual communities in the world. How? One of the key factors lies in their genetics. Surprisingly, studies have shown that despite isolation, Ashkenazim possess high genomic heterogeneity. Mixed origins, Middle Eastern, European, Slavic, Turkic, led to a wide range of immune responses. This helped them survive the plague and other epidemics that decimated monoethnic populations. Their DNA is like a genetic shield that arose thanks to the diversity of their ancestors. This biological advantage, of which they themselves were long unaware, became the key to the survival of the people in the harshest conditions. The high concentration of unique genetic mutations among Ashkenazim became the subject of serious study as early as the 20th century. Scientists noted, in this population, rare hereditary diseases such as Tay-Sachs disease, Bloom syndrome, Gaucher's disease, and certain forms of breast cancer associated with mutations in the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes occur unusually often. All this is the result of the so-called bottleneck effect. When a small, isolated group gives rise to future generations, passing on a limited set of genes. In the case of Ashkenazim, this may have occurred in the Middle Ages, when Jewish communities in Eastern Europe were small and closed. But it was precisely thanks to these mutations that it became possible to trace the group's origins and migrations with unprecedented precision. The genetic price of survival was high, but it gave science a unique material for decoding history. From the beginning of the 20th century, scientists were intrigued by the phenomenon. Ashkenazi Jews make up a tiny percentage of the world's population, yet their share among Nobel laureates, outstanding scientists, writers, and cultural figures is astonishingly high. How can this be explained? There are two versions. The first is genetic. Supposedly within the closed community, selection for intelligence occurred over centuries. Men with outstanding abilities became rabbis, spiritual leaders, and had more children. This hypothesis has received partial confirmation in genetic studies, which have identified DNA regions associated with cognitive functions. The second version is cultural. Traditions of literacy, reverence for scholarship, compulsory study of the Talmud from childhood. All this created an environment in which intellectual work was valued above all else. Perhaps a synergy effect occurred. Genetic potential was overlaid with a powerful educational tradition. The history of the Ashkenazim is full not only of achievements, but also of demonization. For centuries, they became the target of the fiercest prejudices. Accused of witchcraft, conspiracy, poisoning wells, usury, and even controlling world events. Why did Ashkenazim in particular provoke such irrational hatred? Partly because of their social visibility. Living separately, yet actively participating in public life, in trade, finance, science, they were more noticeable than others. Their differences in language, dress, and rituals reinforced the effect of otherness. But the main cause of fear was misunderstanding. When a small group of people demonstrates intellectual and economic influence, it is easier for society to believe in a conspiracy than in statistics. The genetic uniqueness of Ashkenazim only fuels the fire. Although in reality, it is merely the result of historical twists and centuries-long struggle for survival. The modern state of Israel is not a monolith, but a colorful genetic and cultural kaleidoscope. Ashkenazim, who arrived from Europe in the 20th century, played a key role in its founding and political architecture. They formed the intellectual and administrative elite of the new state. But their genetic and cultural identity sharply differs from other Jewish groups. Mizrahim, Jews from Arab countries. Sephardim, descendants of Spanish Jews. Beta Israel from Ethiopia, Bukharan, and Mountain Jews. All have different origins, languages, traditions, and even haplogroups. This creates a unique tension. Ostensibly one people, but with different roots. Inside Israel, this difference is felt not only in daily life, but also in politics, marriages, and resource distribution. Ashkenazim are often accused of dominance and privilege, and yet their path is also one of exiles and assimilation, just begun differently. Ashkenazi Jews were the main targets of anti-Semitism in Europe for centuries. As early as the Middle Ages, they were accused of ritual murders. Synagogues were burned. They were expelled from cities, deprived of rights. During the plague of the 14th century, they were mass burned, allegedly for poisoning the water. In modern times, pogroms in the Russian Empire became a routine tragedy, wiping Jewish shtetls off the map. But the peak of horror came in the 20th century. The Holocaust destroyed about 6 million Jews, the overwhelming majority of them Ashkenazim. These genocidal campaigns were not just acts of violence, but attempts to erase the very memory of the people. The fact that they managed not only to survive but also to preserve their language, culture, and traditions is almost a biological and spiritual miracle. And it is precisely this historical experience that has turned Ashkenazi identity into a nerve, exposed and sensitive to anything that threatens survival. The names of Ashkenazim are firmly inscribed in world science, culture, and politics. Albert Einstein, the revolutionary of physics, Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, Franz Kafka, the symbol of the century's absurdity. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. In the 20th century, a huge number of Nobel laureates in physics, chemistry, economics, and medicine were Ashkenazim. Henry Kissinger, Madeleine Albright, George Soros. Their names became symbols of influence in world politics and finance. In culture, Steven Spielberg, Bob Dylan, Woody Allen. These people were born in different countries, spoke different languages, but carried within them the code of a community formed over centuries. Their achievements are not just individual success, but the result of collective memory, values, and survival. They are descendants of a people who were once marked for destruction. And in this context, their contribution becomes not just significant but almost symbolic. Ashkenazim survived not thanks to numbers or military strength, but thanks to culture. From childhood, a child in a traditional Ashkenazi family found themselves in a world of text. Torah, Talmud, commentaries, discussions. Learning was not an obligation but a value. At the centers of shtetls always stood synagogues and schools. Even in poverty, children learned to read, debate, analyze. A book was not a luxury but a continuation of the memory of ancestors. Family and community, the two pillars on which identity rested. A Jew was never alone. Behind them stood generations, traditions, commandments. Even in exile, Ashkenazim created microscopic societies with clear norms and institutions. It was precisely this internal structure that allowed them not to dissolve into the majority, but to preserve themselves in every new country. Their cultural code is not just customs, but a mechanism for reproducing meaning. It was passed not by blood, but by the words spoken at the Sabbath table. Genetic research on Ashkenazim has aroused not only academic interest, but also a storm of speculation. Some have tried to prove their non-Semitic origin in order to deny their right to the Promised Land. Others, on the contrary, insist on their pure line, ignoring the complexity of ethnogenesis. In the 20th century, the Nazis tried to use biology as a tool of destruction. Today, politicians sometimes do the same, only with words. Genetics becomes an ideological instrument. Who has the right to the land, to repatriation, to recognition? This is especially acute in debates around the Khazar theory. For some, Acknowledging the Khazar trace in Ashkenazi history is a scientific fact. For others, a political threat. But science clearly says an ethnos is not a pure line, but a complex alloy of migrations, assimilations, and adaptations. And Ashkenazim are an example of how the intertwining of different origins can create something unique. The history of the Ashkenazi Jews is not just a chronicle of migrations and genetic mutations. It is a path full of pain, exiles, losses, and yet victories. Victories of spirit, knowledge, culture. Their DNA is not a passport, but an imprint of great overcoming. They are not united by origin, but by the ability to preserve their essence among strangers. This is what makes Ashkenazim a phenomenon. Not isolation, but flexibility, not separation, but memory, not purity of blood, but purity of thought. In everyone who speaks Yiddish, who takes the Talmud in hand, who keeps the Sabbath candle, there lives not just a gene, but 1,000 years of journey. And even if science finds Slavs, Khazars, or Europeans in their DNA, it does not cancel the main thing. Ashkenazim have proven that a people can be united not around ethnicity, but around an idea. And in this lies their great secret and pride.